Hey, what's up guys? Sir Emanon here, and welcome to another deck profile on the channel today. So this time it's going to be for Rokket Orcust, as promised, since you guys did manage to get the Road to 1000 Dueling Book rating episode up to 100 likes. So first off, just want to thank you guys for your support on that. But this is a pretty fun rogue deck. It's very popular, and it has been meta for quite some time, as you guys are aware. And I had quite a bit of enjoyment just sitting down and trying to test and optimize the build to the best of my ability to make it as competitively viable as I could. So this is, as per usual, going to be a live deck building session, just so you guys can see that thought process as well as why I chose individual cards and my general approach to the metagame and things of that nature. So this is going to be a very detailed video. I even have some notes in front of me just to help me stay on track and organized so that I don't ramble too far off track. And I did spend a lot of time kind of preparing it, so if this video does get 150 likes, I will do a detailed competitorial video. And also, if you are new here and enjoy informative, competitive, and in-depth Yu-Gi-Oh content, please do consider subscribing. 54% of the people watching this video aren't subscribed, and if we do manage to hit 5,000 by the end of November, I will be doing, of course, a free giveaway tournament, so definitely be on the lookout for that if we manage to reach that milestone. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into some of the basic context, I guess, behind why I chose a Rokket Orcust list as opposed to like other Orcust builds. So I think first off, what we have to do is sort of analyze the problems with Orcust first of all. So I think if you were playing any rogue deck, you sort of have to recognize the deck's shortcomings and realize what the deck's strengths are as well, but you have to sort of cover for its weaknesses as best as you can so you can combat the metagame as best as possible. So first off, the biggest problem is, of course, the fact that the deck is just normal summon reliant. Of course, we got the release of yugioh, the Orcust Mech Knight, which is a very, very good starter card in its own right, but it is a normal summon, and a lot of the power plays that the deck requires involve graveyard setup in some capacity, whether it be in the past things like Mathematician, or you have things like Scrap Recycler nowadays, right? So all these cards are cards that are very good at getting your Orcust engine into the graveyard, but they all require your normal summons. So this is kind of the problem with the deck that leads into the next problem, which that this inherently makes the deck weak to hand traps. So literally any interruption on your normal summon is a lot of the time going to be resulting in you passing your turn. Because we don't have cards like Nightmare Mermaid and Harp Horror that just inherently get more value when you do get stopped, and you don't have as much access to contingency plays, you really are reliant on that normal summon resolving in a lot of cases if you aren't building your deck accordingly. So this is also leading into the third problem, is that there is a severe lack of powerful extenders. So in the past, you had things like Engage, which was just one of the best extenders in the entire game at the time, where Striker Orcust was so powerful because Engage allowed you to not only toolbox into the Striker spells, but it just acted as its own sort of extension. And of course, again, having access to Harp definitely helped there, but because we don't have a lot of very powerful supplementary tools, it can be definitely hard to actually make the Orcust engine run smoothly and be cohesive the way that it needs to be in order to get its engine going. And finally, the last part is kind of just the problem that can't really be fixed at this current moment, which is the fact that there's a lot of engine requirements just inherently. So the Orcust engine requires a lot of cards that aren't super great to draw in hand. You don't really want Nightmare unless you have a way to get it out of hand. You don't really love drawing Symbol, and you especially don't want to draw, the World Wand, because, a lot of these cards just don't get value unless if you can combine them with other cards to extract their value. So now that I've outlined the problems, I'm going to go over some of the current popular solutions that a lot of people are incorporating into their current Orcust lists, and some of the drawbacks and problems that I personally have with them. So first is the one that I already mentioned, which is the Scrap engine. So this typically, of course, consists of Scrap Recycler, and then you have also Crystron Rosenix to be able to send off of it, if I can find it. And you also have Scrap Golem to be able to combo and reuse and abuse the recycle as much as you can. And ultimately this results in combos of Scrap Wyvern, and you go into Lib, and you go into, of course, Succession and all that good stuff. Of course, the problem with this is that while it's very, very high ceiling, it requires a lot of hard garnets. Specifically the Rosenix and the Scrap Golem are cards that if you draw in combination with their Scrap Recycler, you have to deviate very substantially if you don't have a way to get these cards out of your hand. And it also doesn't resolve the fact that the deck is very normal summon reliant. That is one of the instances and examples that I pointed to in that previous point. It's also very weak to hand traps still, and these cards can't ever be considered really extenders. They're only ever going to be starters. So if you draw like a combination of like Scrap Recyclers and Gyusus, then like all the time you're going to try and go for the higher ceiling play, but then when you ultimately end up getting hand trapped a lot of the time, then it's going to be very, very hard to push past it, because now you're running so many starter cards but not really any way to actually push past disruption. The second option that people are actually turning to right now is the Sacred Beast engine. So I've seen a lot of builds, or some builds rather, incorporate things like Dark Beckoning Beast, as well as Chaos Summoning Beast, and the opening of the Spirit Gates. So this is a way to access a copy of Curious the Lightsworn Dominion, which is a very, very nice tool to be able to try and mill and get access to your Orcust cards. It's also link 3, so you can climb into things like Appaloosa. So this is a very, very interesting engine, just because you have a lot of accessibility to it. So you have 6 ways essentially to get to the 1 card play, and it doesn't really have hard garnets. Like, sure, you don't really love drawing the Chaos Summoning Beast, but unlike the Scrap Engine, if you have it in hand, but you still have the starters to be able to make the engine roll, then it's still fine, because you're able to just, continue playing, because you're ultimately going to want it in hand anyways, right? But it still unfortunately does have the same issues that the Scrap Engine has, in terms of not being able to really resolve the normal summon reliance, and just ultimately being weak to hand traps still. So the fact that you're still incorporating a card or a group of cards that folds to the same disruption as the rest of your entire deck doesn't make the deck do anything flexible or versatile or unique necessarily inherently. The third option that I've seen people incorporate is the DD package. So I've seen, in particular, Lamia, as well as Dark Contract with the Gate, if I can find that as well. So the problem with this, actually the good thing about this, I'll go over the positives first, is that this doesn't require your normal summon, which is nice, and it gets you a free body on board. A free tuner is always nice if you want to go into needle fiber plays. It's an extender, and it's not necessarily a starter, so that's fine in terms of diversifying what options you have access to. But the problem with this is that, of course, going into fiber by itself is not going to really guarantee that you get your Orcust play set up. And if you're going for other needle fiber combos, you would probably much rather just be playing something like Eldritch Synchro, or just another deck that utilizes the Dark Contract engine a lot more fluidly. Because if what you're doing with fiber is summoning brasses off of it, for example, and you're trying to go off for Galatea, that requires that you have specific Orcust pieces in hand to be able to make use of brass, and that makes it so that your ratios have to be, bumped up to make use of that a lot more readily, and then you leave yourself open to more bricks. And again, if your normal summon gets hand trapped, you're just not guaranteed to necessarily find yourself a meaningful play. So if you're not going for fiber and you're going for something like Verite Anaconda, then literally any other extender could work in that instance. But I feel like if you are simply just trying to turbo into Verite Anaconda, then there's other decks that you can conceivably play besides Orcust. I think that a lot of the times, if you are playing Orcust, the reason you want to play it is, as I'll get into later, the reason to play the deck is because it is so resilient. It is very, very, very much grindy and recursive once it gets its engine rolling. And so if you're playing Orcust, I think the engines that you want to facilitate it with are engines that are going to allow it to play the game as much as it can, which again is something that I'll delve into a bit more later. And finally, the last thing that people tend to be playing is, of course, the danger monsters. So these are fine. It's just that the limitation of them makes them a bit unreliable, and you have to dig into some of the less reliable or less powerful danger monsters in order to actually have a higher count of them. But beyond that, it follows the same kind of pattern as the DD engine, in that if you just put the monster on board and like try and make a Galatea with like a Gusi that was negated by like an Imperm or something, it's not really necessarily doing anything, because like the whole point is to try and actually get the Orcust cards into the graveyard to keep cycling. And like these cards can sure like help you ladder into other cards, but it's not going to help you get back into the Orcust play, which ultimately hurts your your recycling, your recursion, your grind game, and all the stuff that Orcust is known for. So with all that being said, I want to turn to what I feel the best solution is, and the ultimate win condition of the deck. So I think the best solution to this is, as you can obviously tell, the Rokket engine. So Quick Launch is an amazing starter and an extender in its own right. It allows you to get access to Tracer, of course, and if you guys are not aware, basically Tracer is a 1-card level 8 synchro that is dark. So you go ahead and get your Tracer, you go for Striker Dragon. Striker Dragon allows you to add a copy of Boot Sector Launch, and then you Striker Dragon back the Tracer back to hand, and then you Boot Sector it out, and then you Tracer pop the Boot to get Rocket Recharger. And then this way, you synchro these two into Chaos Ruler, which essentially is a better copy of or a better version of Curious because it allows you to mill more cards and allows you to get a resource to your hand. So it also has the added benefit of bringing itself back from grave, which is really, really nice. So it's really, really good because it fills a kind of similar role to this Sacred Beasts because of a card as powerful as Chaos Ruler, just getting you resources into the graveyard. But there are three key benefits with this that the other engines don't really have. So first off is that the engine itself, I think, works better. So I think, again, Ruler is a superior card to Curious for the reasons that I described, and you don't need your normal summon if you open Quick Launch, right? So that allows you to play when your Gyusu gets stopped so that you have another sort of contingency to be able to go into other options. It's also very versatile because you can branch out into other plays because Tracer is, of course, a level 4 tuner, so you have a lot of access that way to other plays and other alternatives that you might wish to incorporate. And the engine requirements themselves, being Tracer, Recharger, and Boot, depending on how you see the engine requirements, these are actually much better to draw because if you draw any of them, they don't preclude you from performing the combo, unlike the Scrap engine. So I really do like it for that aspect. And the second benefit is that by running fewer, clunkier cards, you have more room for hand traps and defensive cards. So because we're eliminating the concentration of bricks, engine requirements, and cards that are just inferior to draw, we're able to play cards that allow us to more flexibly go second first off, and also just to supplement our board, or allow us to fall back on some options if we do get hand trapped and we somehow don't have ways to extend. This is one of the best ways to go about doing that, I feel. And the third and probably the most important benefit is that you just get to play the game more. So the idea behind my entire build, I'm just going to go into the general win condition of the deck now, is to sacrifice some of the power that you're probably going to see in other Orcust builds. For example, you're not really going to see VFD in this build, you're not going to see Dragoon necessarily, though you can play it, but you're not going to see all the big wombo combo shenanigans that other people are trying to go for. But instead, you're favoring a more consistent, cohesive strategy that has resiliency through disruption. So what I mean by this is you actually get to play Orcust every game instead of summon, get hand trapped, and then pass for 80% of the time, and then go VFD, Dragoon, Rusty, and the whole 9 yards the other 20% of the time. So by getting to play the Orcust engine a lot more, you're able to actually do what the deck is designed to do instead of try and play a lot of other cards that can fulfill other sort of win conditions if they resolve, but have a much less likelihood or a much lower likelihood of resolving. So with all of that being said, I'm finally going to go ahead and get to the deck profile itself. So I will also preface this by saying that I will cover alternatives and cards that I considered after I go through the main and extra deck, because I do have a lot of things to say about the cards that ultimately didn't end up making the cut, but you can certainly incorporate if you did want to. So first off, for the main deck, we have, of course, the obligatory starter card, which is going to be 3 copies of Gyusu, the Orcust Mech Knight. Now, this is the normal summon that you have to leave in if you're playing Orcust, simply because it is an Orcust by name. It allows you to do what you want to do, and it by itself synergizes with the engine without requiring any additional cards that you don't desire to play, unlike the Scraps. So, very, very good card, and pretty self-explanatory. Next, of course, is the 3 copies of Quick Launch. This also needs very, very little explanation. So, Quick Launch is a card that allows you to get access to a tuner, allows you to get access to just more extension, and being not once per turn is also very nice. And just getting access to Chaos Ruler allows you to open up so many more plays that the deck didn't previously have. So with that, of course, we are going to be playing the 1 copy of Tracer for now. Spoiler alert, we do change this a bit later on. We're going to be playing the Recharger, and then we're going to be playing the Boot Sector. So I'm going to be kind of going over, this is sort of just my thought process as far as how I initially started the deck. So when I first sat down to theory Rokket Orcust, this was the ratio that I settled on. I thought this was pretty good. But the problem I was kind of running into is that, okay, you have 3 Quick Launch, which is a very good extender, but this is literally only 6 cards that are really, really good. So I thought, okay, what are some ways that we can maybe supplement this to make this a little bit better? And I thought, okay, let's actually try and increase the ratio of Tracer. So this seemed a little bit unintuitive, but Tracer, being a normal summon, does still allow you to get into Chaos Ruler, worst case scenario, even if you don't open Quick Launch. And what it allows you to do is that if you have Chaos Ruler to be able to mill Nightmare, then you don't really miss your normal summon on Gyusu. Obviously, if you open Gyusu, like, it's the more preferred normal summon in a lot of cases. But having Tracer there as kind of a backup normal summon isn't all that bad either. So I ended up actually liking this so much that I bumped it up to 2, and then I eventually upped it to 3, because this is a card that, when combined with the other engines that I'll get to later in the deck, is a card that I actually wanted to see quite often. And there are cards that combo with it very, very nicely, as I'll get into a bit later. But the problems now became, okay, well, I am sort of falling into the trap of too many normal summons. So how can I make Tracer a card that can be a normal or a special summon depending on the instance? If you think of a deck like Salamangreat, for example, that deck has a lot of cards like Jack Jaguar and Spinny and Foxy and all these cards that can be normal summons, but also can be flexibly special summons just depending on what other cards you opened. So the cards that I feel like could allow for this to become more of a special summon is if you have ways to put bodies on board first so that you can get access to Boot Sector. So what this means is I wanted a larger dragon package in general, and the best way to access dragons without using your normal summon is to go ahead and add 3 copies of Chaos Space. So what this allows you to do is, of course, add the baby Chaos Dragons to your deck, that being 1 copy of Collapse Serpent, 1 copy of Wyvern Burster, because by having Chaos Space, discarding any of your Orcusts or discarding whatever resources that you don't need at the time, you get access to Wyvern Burster, which gets you to Boot as well as to Collapse Serpent, so you get a lot more value. This makes it so that if you draw a combination of this plus Tracer, then you can go into Chaos Ruler without normal summoning. So it acts as a roundabout way of quick launch in its own way, right? But then I thought, okay, what if you have Chaos Space, but you don't have Tracer? Then what exactly are you doing with the baby Chaos Dragons? Like, they're kind of just sitting there, and they don't actually really do anything. So what ultimately I ended up doing was going for... Actually, I should put the extra deck monsters for the Rocket package first. So I already mentioned this, but it's a Striker Dragon, of course, and I mentioned the Chaos Ruler. This should be pretty self-explanatory. But going back to the point of Chaos Space, right? If you open it in isolation and you don't have Tracer to combo with it, how do you exactly make a play with just the baby Chaos Dragons? And I actually realized if you go for a copy of Romulus and actually use that to search a copy of Dragon Ravine, and then use Ravine to be able to pitch whatever resource you have, because keeping in mind that Chaos Space allows you to cycle through and get your original White Dragon Wyvern Burster back. It's going to be Wyvern Burster in most cases, right? So you're going to be able to get a draw along the way, as well as Wyvern Burster back in hand. So you have a free pitch to be able to go for Ravine, so you don't minus yourself. And you get to be able to send Absa Router to Grave. So what this allows you to do is allows you to have access to Tracer if you open just Chaos Space. So now Chaos Space turns from an extender into a starter card. Because now, if you open just Chaos Space plus any lighter dark monster, you're able to access Chaos Ruler and still have your normal summon if you excavate Girsu off of it. So that's why I think that this is a really, really solid engine to be able to include in a deck like this. But then I was thinking, okay, so this is all good, but I feel like I'm still a little bit short on starters, a little bit short on extenders. So obviously we got to add a copy of Foolish Burial just because we're playing Orcust, right? Pretty self-explanatory. And then I was thinking, okay, so what are ways that we can maybe better manage like excess Tracers, like excess dragons that we might not want to draw? Like, what if we just draw Router and we don't have like a good way to get it into the grave? Like, what happens if we just draw these errant pieces that aren't super good to draw? Because keeping in mind, like, none of these are hard garnets by any means, but a lot of them require other cards to kind of make use out of their effects to the best of their ability, right? So the thought process there was, okay, what if we actually bumped up Dragon Ravine to make it so that A, you don't rely on Romulus necessarily to get it, but also B, you get more access to your Dragon package because you're able to go for a Router more. Now, the problem I ran into with this was that, okay, it was very conducive in terms of fixing the problems of seeing your random dragon pieces. But what happens if you want to be able to use... Oops, I accidentally right-clicked there. What happens if you want to be able to utilize the Tracer engine and go into Chaos Ruler and still preserve your normal summon? Like, what are some ways that we can actually utilize that? And I thought, okay, this is also kind of circling back to the problem of maybe drawing too many dragons, like maybe drawing, like, Tracer, Ravine, like, what does Tracer Ravine get you, right? So that, okay, what's something that I can send off of Ravine that'll get value in Grave that allows you to still use Tracer without normal summoning? So I'm like, wait, what if we just play a copy of Supreme King Dragon Darkworm? So what Darkworm allows you to do is that it turns Ravine now into a much better starter play. So imagine this, right? You open Ravine and you open any of these 5 cards. You open either a Tracer, a Dark Worm, or an Abs Router. You're able to then combine those to make it so that you're able to go for Tracer with Boot Sector and do all of that for Chaos Ruler without committing to your normal summon at all. So if you open Ravine plus Tracer, you just dump your Dark Worm, you Dark Worm for your Striker, and then you Striker pop to add back Tracer, and then bam, you have Boot Sector, and you can go Boot Sector summon Tracer and do it that way. If you open Ravine plus Dark Worm, you just do, you just pitch the Dark Worm and send Abs Router. That way, you actually get to keep the Striker Dragon on the board, and you're able to access Tracer that way. And you still do the same stuff with Dark Worm summoning itself and all that good stuff. And conversely, if you open Ravine plus Abs Router, you just pitch the Abs Router and send the Dark Worm. So any combination of Ravine plus these 5 cards lets you go into Chaos Warrior without your normal summon. So I really, really liked that. Now we have a solid 13 ways that you can get your Orcust engine possibly rolling, and many of which don't require your normal summon. So I liked that. It solves the problem of the normal summon reliance. It allows you to play not too many bricks. Like, all these cards around here, they're not ideal to draw, but they're fine to draw. Like, drawing the baby Chaos Dragons, like, black is a lot worse to draw than white, but drawing white is, like, fine to draw, right? And then in some cases, drawing the Collapse Serpent isn't too bad either. So these are never really going to be entirely dead draws that literally contribute nothing to your hand in any case. And the best part about playing cards like Dark Worm and Abs Router is that not only do you have Ravine to get them out of hand, but you also have Chaos Space. So Chaos Space Dark Worm and Chaos Space Abs Router both get you a lot of value just by themselves. And I really like that you have now a lot of cards that can get you these sort of soft garnets, but not really soft garnets, out of your hand and into the graveyard. So these turn from garnets into just high value cards when not only do they just get out of your hand, but you get some other value additionally along the way. So now we have the dragon portion kind of covered and discussed over. We can go over the Orcust part of the build. So because we're playing Orcust, it is a bit tricky because a lot of these cards besides Gyusu you don't really want to see in your opening hand. But that being said, we do now have 6 solid ways to actually get them from hand into the graveyard. Now, we don't want to play too many cards that want to be discarded, because if we open, say, like Nightmare plus like Dark Worm and Abs Router and Ravine, then it's like, which one do you end up discarding, right? Well, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have too many things to get out of your hand, which is why we're only playing one of each of these. Because of course, drawing Ravine plus, Abs Router is really nice, and I was testing 2 at some points, but then I found that if you draw Abs Router by itself, it's not really that good. And like, if you draw too many cards that want to be discarded off of Ravine or off of Chaos Space, then you're not really in a good position either. But with that being said, I still think that the correct ratio for Nightmare in this list is actually 3. Because if you think about it, Chaos Ruler, as powerful of a card as it actually is, requires very specific excavates to be effective. You only really have a couple of options here. Of course, you can randomly hit like an Abs Router and get value out of it. But you can also only really get Nightmare or Gyusu to be able to, make use of your actual Orcust engine reliably. Because of course you can hit cards like Symbol and World Wand, but without the other cards, they don't actually do anything in isolation by themselves. So by that logic, you have to kind of play Nightmare at a higher ratio, because it's a card that needs to be revealed off of Chaos Ruler in order for Chaos Ruler to be worth playing, in my opinion. Additionally, because you are playing the 6 ways to get cards out of your hand, it hurts less to play more of these. And granted, again, you would rather combo it with like these cards to be able to actually get your Dragon package going. But if you think about it, if you have Nightmare in the first place and you have the Ravine and the Chaos Space, then you don't really need to resort to going into Chaos Ruler at all. Like, if you have the ability and the capacity to get Nightmare in a grave, then that's great. You can use the Tracer and the other stuff for other purposes, which is really, really flexible and really nice. So because of this, I thought quite a bit on what I felt the ratios for the other Orcusts should be. And Symbol is one that I am still not 100% sure if this is completely correct, but right now I'm on 2 Symbol. So I'm between 1 and 2 a lot, but the issue I'm running into is that, first off, of course, you don't really want to run out of your symbols for your grind game, which definitely is a factor, but also it can be good to have access to if you don't have Gyusu access, just because if you go for the myriad of ways to get Chaos Ruler onto the board without committing to your normal summon, and you hit a symbol and no other Orcusts, then it's not horrible because at least you can normal it and go into Galatea to like try and set up a little bit. Granted, of course, symbol doesn't do anything by itself if you don't have your other, Orcus in rotation all the time. But at the very least, you can, link away stuff like your Galatea and then bring it back and then go for a ding with Babel setup. And it's like all right, depending on how you're able to set it up. But in most cases, again, this is not the ideal card to draw. So between 1 and 2, I feel is like somewhere where you want to play. Obviously, you have to pick one. So I'm on 2 right now just because of the grind ability, as well as just having the resource available and the ability to use it in a pinch when you have other resources that you can utilize it with. And then finally, we have the World Wand. This is unfortunately one of the worst cards in the entire deck, if not the worst card in the deck to draw, just because, well, it doesn't really do anything. You have to draw it with one of your other cards that get it out of your hand. And I just don't want a card that doesn't do anything in my hand. That's why I'm not playing 2 of it. And it's true that like if you have it in hand and you have no way to get it out, then it makes your Nightmare a lot worse. But I don't think that justifies playing 2 of it. It literally is just a Garnet. I believe that this is more of a hard Garnet than any of the Dragon Engine in the entire deck, which is unfortunate to say because it is part of the Orcust lineup and there's no way that we can conceivably cut it. But it is what it is, and we kind of have to just live with our choices. Then we also got to the Orcust, Spell and Traps, of course, so other parts of the engine that are not ideal to draw, but they're okay to draw. So we got Babel and we have Crescendo. These cards are fine. They're not necessarily what you want to see, but they'll also unlock your hand to be able to access things in other ways. For example, if you open one of the spells, you can just set the other with Galatea. And by drawing them, it also minimizes the risk of course, or it completely minimizes the risk of milling them off of Chaos Rulers so that you can't use them that turn. So it's not horrible to draw these cards, but they don't contribute to your combo in any meaningful way either. So in terms of the scale of what we want to draw versus what we don't want to draw, these rank somewhere around here. And then finally, the honorary Orcust card is going to be Gizmek, Orochi, the Serpentron Sky Slasher. Not really too much needed here. If you're familiar with Orcust, it allows you to set up things with Top Logic Zero Boros very well. Whoops. It also allows you to just make IP setups. It lets you grind very, very nicely. Overall, just a solid card, and at worst case scenario, it is an extender. So this does it for about all of the engine cards. And as you can see, there's a lot of very strong ways that you can get into Chaos Ruler or just get into your Orcust setup in general. And these are the worst cards. Like these 5 are the worst cards, but they're not even that bad to draw, right? Like drawing Boot Sector isn't that bad if you have Tracer already. Like Recharger is not amazing, but you can still summon it off Boot Sector if you have other dragons. Again, I mentioned if you draw these, it's fine because you minimize the chance of milling them off Ruler. And the World Wand's the only real one that I'm never happy to see, but I'll take just one hard Garnet in 40. And with that actually leaves you room for hand traps, like I mentioned. So these are just the defensive cards that you have space for and you want to incorporate into your engine. This can be a meta call, and you can definitely change these up based on what you're expecting to play against. But for now, I'm on 3 Nibiru, 3 Veiler, and actually 3 DD Crow. So the reason I'm on this specific lineup is because you can actually add them to hand off a Chaos Ruler, worst case scenario if you don't pick up a Girsu. And additionally, you are able to actually stop a variety of decks that are on DB ladder. So DD Crow is good against the Buster Blader deck because you can hit the Buster Blader monster when they try and use memories. It's also good against Dino. Nibiru is good against the combo decks, and Veiler is just a good catch-all hand trap. I would like to play Gamma, but I'm kind of being a little bit greedy in my sort of preservation of Garnets, and I really don't want to include too many more in a deck that's pretty bricky by nature. But they will be included in the side deck. I'll just say this right now. So with that, we'll just go ahead and move on to the extra deck a little bit here. So the extra deck is really just a bunch of ways to kind of make use of the main deck cards. So of course we got an Orcust engine, which is going to be 2 Galatea and 2 Dingirsu. A lot of builds previously would play 3 Galatea, but there simply isn't the space just with how much utility I'm trying to run. And you're not grinding nearly as much as you used to. I did say that, of course, one of the biggest strengths of Orcust is the grind potential, but grinding now just kind of takes on a different term from what it did in previous formats. So grinding is just a couple of turns, whereas previously it might have been like 6, 7, 8 turns. And you don't really need that many resources to be able to play the game. So next up is going to be just other cards that kind of facilitate the the main deck monsters, as I was mentioning. So of course you got to play the one copy of Link Kuriboh just to be able to pair with the yugioh token, of course. Playing the one copy of Barricade Board Blocker, because this is one of the ways that you can get that pesky wand out of your hand, and it is nice just to have a generic Link to Dark that fits into your engine when you're Tracer locked or when you're locked under your Orcust cards in general. Not sure why the image isn't showing, but this is Barricade Board Blocker, as you can see by the name there. And then next we got a copy of IP Masquerena. So this is a pretty good card as just one of your disruption pieces. I'm really not sure why Dueling Book is not loading these images. That is a little bit annoying, but we will do our best here. Masquerena is of course very nice to be able to pair with your Babble just to be able to have access to plays in your opponent's turn. There we go. Barricade's still having trouble here. But Masquerena in itself is a very solid disruption tool. Not too much to say there. And to pair with that, we of course have Nightmare Unicorn. Just more generic things to have interruption and removal tools. Pretty self-explanatory there. Then we also have a copy of Topologic Zero Boros, which I did mention. This is one of the better things to go into with Masquerena if you have the capacity to, just because this card just completely wipes out back row decks, and it's one of the last things that your opponent might be reading, just because this deck isn't really that popular at the moment. You can use like your ding setups, your other interruptions, and then go into Zero Boros with Masquerena, and then go for a Gizmic play, and then suddenly the game is on a very, very short timer. And then we have one of the ways to close out the game. I'm actually picking Access Code here. I'll get into why I'm not playing Boros Sword in a bit here when I get to the alternatives. But I like Access Code as a way to actually just remove threats on the board, just because this deck is lacking some removal, especially in the back row department. So I want to make sure that I'm able to clear just random excess tools or pieces that my opponent might still have on their board before going for game. I'm not really, I don't really find myself in a lot of cases where I'm stressed for damage necessarily. So I feel like Access Code is fine in a lot of cases. But you can definitely play Boros Sword if you want to, which I'll get into, of course, as I just mentioned. And then finally, I have some cards that are just generally good to supplement with the Dragon engine. So first off is a copy of Borreload Savage Dragon. So this is a card that in cases where you don't need to go Chaos Ruler, i.e. you have, Nightmare hard drawn with one of your discard outlets, or you have Yugioh hard drawn, you can go into Savage to help play around hand traps better, which is really, really nice. And this deck does lack a lot of hard negation. So that's something that a lot of other decks don't really have, right? Like a lot of decks just have negates left and right, but this deck not so much. So you want to be able to supplement your interrupts with just solid ways to actually ensure that they resolve. And Savage is, of course, one of the best ways to do so. And then finally, we have a copy of Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres. Now, this is an interesting one because it's not really intuitively a card you would want to play in Orcust. It's not a dark monster, so when you get locked into Tracer or Nightmare, that can be an issue, and that does come up like occasionally. But a lot of the times when you're using it is when you start off with like Chaos Space and you already have Tracer access, so you don't necessarily have to go for Ravine with Romulus. You can just turn these into Seal and just put up an extra interruption on your board, which is nice. This Barricade not loading is really annoying me, and I hope that it shows up soon. There we go. I just had to type again into that search bar, and it worked up pretty fine. So that is it for the entire main and extra deck. Now, before going on to the side deck, I'm going to go over some alternatives that I considered playing, but ultimately ended up not playing at the end of it for various reasons. But you can choose to play them if you find them useful for your own personal list. So first off is the Dark Grepher, Armageddon Knight, Rhoda package, the Dark Warrior Boys. These cards are fine. They're just additional normal summons, and I valued having actually Tracer over these cards because the potential of Chaos Ruler I feel is higher ceiling than just getting a Nightmare into Grave guaranteed, which is like fine, but I honestly feel like if we're going this hard for Chaos Ruler, I want to actually just maximize on it. So I felt that of course these cards are inferior to Girsu in terms of the engine, and so I ultimately decided to cut them just to make sure that I didn't have too many normal summons. Otherwise, they are very, very good cards. Next up is Brass Bombard. This is a card that a lot of people do play, but I'm actually not playing Fiber in this list, and I guess I can cover Fiber here as well. So, like I mentioned earlier with like the DD engine and all that stuff, I really don't think that Fiber is necessarily going to get you out of the hands where you're struggling to make a play. You have to open very particularly. You have to open a starter, and you have to open like and that starter has to like not resolve, because if you're resolving Gyusu or even other builds, if you're resolving like Scrap Recycle or something, then you're never really gonna go for Fiber over those plays. So it has to be stopped, and you have to draw a way to get a tuner extender, and you have to have another Orcust to be able to get out of your hand. It's just a lot of cards or a lot of things that have to go well in order for Brass to actually be used a lot of the time. And it's true that you can get stuff out of your hand, but I'm trying not to draw more Orcusts that rely on other cards to make the engine work. I'd rather just not draw those cards to begin with. You can kind of put actually Orchestrated Return in a similar boat. So this card, while I would consider it more than I would Bombard, just because it is searchable and it's toolboxable via Gala, of course. Again, I'm not trying to open too many of the Orcus besides Gyusu to begin with, and I already have ways to get Nightmare out of my hand if I draw it, or like World Wand or Symbol via Ravine and Chaos Space that get me guaranteed value rather than just like two cards that might be end up not being the best to draw. And especially if you're playing this in like a scrap build, like if you draw cards like Golem or the Rosenix or just the other cards that don't help you with your combo, then this doesn't end up doing anything. Whereas I know what I'm getting if I'm discarding a Nightmare for Ravine. I know what I'm getting when I'm discarding it for Chaos Space. So that's why I feel like those cards are ultimately better to run in this particular build. Next up is Allure of Darkness. This card is like really interesting, and I'm so 50-50 on it because like you do have a lot of cards that are excess to draw, and especially if you're playing some dark hand traps. Like there are instances where you just want these out of your hand, right? But ultimately, there are also times you just want to keep them in hand because you drew. I kind of harp on the discard outlets a lot, but they do really come up when you're drawing this many or you're playing this many of them. And ultimately, you want those resources in your hand most of the time rather than just banished. It's true that they can help you draw into these cards more often, but you're playing such a high concentration of them. These are 16 solid cards that like you don't mind seeing. Like these are very, very good ways to have at least a chance to be able to play the game. And so I don't feel like Allure is necessarily needed. The best argument for it is, of course, drawing side deck cards, but I felt ultimately it wasn't that needed. Next up is the Dragoon package. So I'm just going to put Dragoon here. So this is a fine option if you get hand trapped. And I was playing it in my Road to 1000 Dueling Book Rating series, but ultimately decided to cut it. I just honestly want to reduce bricks. You definitely can choose to run it, but it also cuts into your extra deck utility slots, so that's something to keep in mind as well. It also doesn't help you necessarily play around stuff like Nibiru the way that Savage can, so I thought that actually Savage was better given how many ways I have access to Tracer. So again, this is a decent card to run, but I ultimately chose not to run it. Next up is Rusty and Friends. So we have the PK cards. These cards are good, especially if you have Chaos Ruler, right? Because like the Milling the Monsters is amazing, and you get so much value. And Rusty is also just a very clean way to clean up your board and just make something that actually is a threat. Of course, interactions with Ningirsu is nice. It's just that I really don't feel like you need to run this with like VFD and everything to actually win the game. And apart from that, like the engine requirements are kind of rough to run, because like now you're just introducing more cards that you have to get out of your hand somehow. So if I'm playing like all of these cards plus PKs, then it's like there's too many cards that need to get into the graveyard eventually. And I want to like have a decent number of them so that you get value out of the discard outlets, but not so many of them to where like I'm not able to actually just get all of them reliably into the grave when I need to. And also milling the spells and traps off the Chaos Ruler is also pretty unfortunate. So yeah, sometimes it also is hard to get to Rusty if you get hand trapped or disrupted as well, because it's higher investment than something like a Verte. So I ultimately felt like it just wasn't needed and wasn't conducive to the way that I wanted to play the deck. Next up is Union Carrier, actually, and we can put the Buster Lock here as well, but more so Union Carrier in and of itself, because this card is really, really cool, since you can, of course, equip things like Nightmare, you can equip things like Symbol, World Wand, even Gizmek, and even Absa as a matter of fact. But the thing is that I felt that when you're ending your board all the time, it's going to be like a Masquerena setup, so you don't have anything good to equip Buster Lock with it specifically. By itself, it's actually pretty nice, and it competes for the spot with Heretic Seal, actually. So I'm honestly back and forth between Carrier and Heretic Seal, so you can definitely make this switch if you feel like it's more appropriate. This is still something I am in the process of testing. And then next up, we have what I mentioned earlier, which is Boral Sword. So Boral Sword is fine. It's a very, very good card. I don't think you need to play it with access code. You'd probably pick one or the other. And it's true that a lot of the stuff that you're making is dark in here, but ultimately I feel like just having the versatility of popping, and like removing the cards on the field is also just very, very nice. I go back and forth between this as well, honestly, but I like Access Code just a little bit more. You can definitely opt to run Borosword though if you do so desire. Next up is Longyearsu. So this is a card that I also considered as just another dark monster that I could play if I get hand trapped, so that I can still maybe end on like disruption. I just felt like it ultimately wasn't coming up enough for me to justify its inclusion. It was okay, but honestly, it's just a space issue as well. Other cards just come up more. Next is more Rokkets and other cards to help facilitate Rokkets. So I thought about playing stuff like Silver Rocket, stuff like Unchained Abomination, just things that help the Rokkets themselves get more value, because I found that I was getting the Tracer a lot and would have thus extra quick launches or extra just other resources. And I wanted to maybe like make use of Tracer just being able to have more targets in deck. But I found it was kind of hard to make Abomination to begin with, and then also have Silver ending on your board, and then also when you float from Silver into Tracer, like another target in your deck, like you'd have to play another thing to be able to summon so you can get a pop off Abomination. I just felt it was like way too much to try and actually reliably depend on. Plus, it loses really, really hard to Nibiru. It's a really cool concept, but just one that I ultimately did not end up including. Then finally, there's more dragon stuff. So because I'm playing Seal, I thought of a lot of things I could maybe summon off of it. So one of the things is Red MD I considered, just as like maybe if you get Nibiru, you can go Red MD. But then I was thinking like, what are you gonna really end on necessarily? Especially if you already went into IP. Like if you didn't go into IP, then that's like a perfect card to go into. But sometimes it's just not easy to be able to reliably end on something after you get hit with Nibiru. You just gotta hope that you either open well enough to where you can hand trap them back, or you have Savage on board so you can negate it, the Nibiru, or you just have like your Babel set up and you have Ding engraved, and that's good enough. Another option I considered, was a copy of Tempest. This is a level 7, so I was actually considering things like a Rocket Synchron as well. I was thinking like, okay, maybe we can play Rocket Synchron, maybe we could play like this, because this plus Nightmare also makes Savage a Chaos Warrior, which is cool. It's just that like that really wasn't coming up too much, and it's nice to have a recurable body, but it's also a wind, so that really is a bit of a conflict there as well. Also, I considered Brotar, which is the closest I considered playing, just because having more grind tools is really, really nice, and it just works better with the rest of the deck than I feel most of these cards do. But I just felt like by itself it wasn't doing enough to actually help start the engine. It was more of a late game tool. So I didn't feel like it was that needed when the deck already has stuff that you can do in the late game. And also the Guard Dragons. Ultimately, I just didn't want to play these cards. There's not enough space for them, and there's not really a way that you're able to get into them reliably. If you're playing the Guard Dragons, you might as well just play Dragon Link at this point. So that is it for all of the alternatives and suggestions that I had. So next, we're just going to quickly run through the side deck, which honestly is up for just a lot of things that you guys can be open to testing. So we got the ways to combat the back row, of course. So we got 3 Lightning Storm, we got Feather Duster, and we got Pankratops. Gotta just have your ways to out like Mystic Mine, just back row decks in general. Pretty self-explanatory there. Next, I'm playing the Gamma package in the side, as I mentioned, so just gotta be able to also combat the heavy combo decks. Crow is less powerful against decks like Dragon Link and Infernoble, so you want to be able to have like this just as an additional tool to aid you in that. I'm also citing Triple Tactics Talent. This is one that I'm like kind of iffy on, but the idea is just that people are probably just going to board in a lot of hand traps, because hand traps honestly just end your turn. The cool thing actually that I didn't mention is that this deck plays a little bit better under Lancia, because worst case scenario you can go stuff like Seal Savage, and you actually have like some meaningful ways to get access to that, so that's not half bad. But Tactics Talent is just nice as a way to maybe out Dragoon or just have more resiliency going first. And then finally, I didn't really know what to put in this spot, and I kind of wanted to just have more wider coverage for specifically the Dueling Book metagame. So I decided to just throw in 3 Ash. This honestly can just be anything else. The side deck is not really the focal point of the deck. I wanted to focus a lot more on the main deck, and I'm pretty happy with the main deck itself. So that's going to do it for this video. I know it's really, really long. We're going on 45 minutes here, but this is, I feel like, the best way you can play Orcust at the moment, honestly, is some iteration of this build. Yeah, it covers for a lot of the weaknesses. It still has, of course, trouble playing second, and has trouble trying to set up through like a lot of interruptions. But I think this deck has a lot of the ability to, or it has the ability to solve a lot of the problems that previous decks or previous versions of the deck had and struggled with. So give this deck a try if you are interested in Orcust. I really would recommend it. It's a lot of fun, if nothing else. So yeah, if you made it this far into the video, leave a hashtag. Just leave a hashtag Rokket Orcust, and I'll know that you guys are the real ones. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like as well as any thoughts or feedback in the comments. Subscribe for more informative Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me in Discord, Twitter, or Twitch. All the links are in the description as always. And until next time, I'll catch you in the next video. See you guys.